To comprehend the profound impact of the Black Plague on medieval Europe, it's imperative to journey back to its origins in the distant steppes of Central Asia. In the early 14th century, an invisible menace was lurking in these vast grasslands, one that would ultimately engulf an entire continent in its dark and deadly embrace. At the heart of this unfolding tragedy were fleas, unwitting carriers of the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of the Black Death. Rats, abundant in the steppes, played an unwitting role as hosts to these infected fleas. An intricate ecological web connected these creatures, forming the perfect biological storm that would give rise to one of history's deadliest pandemics. The Silk Road, a labyrinth of interconnected trade routes that spanned continents, served as the conduit through which this pestilence began its inexorable journey westward. Merchants, travelers, and adventurers traversed these ancient highways, unknowingly ferrying infected rodents and fleas in their midst. As these unsuspecting carriers ventured further along the Silk Road, they converged upon the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean. Among them was the Italian port city of Messina, the unwitting entry point of the Black Plague into Europe. In the year 1347, this coastal settlement became the stage for a cataclysmic encounter that would forever alter the course of history. The arrival of the Black Plague in Messina marked a fateful turning point for Europe. Unbeknownst to its inhabitants, the lethal pathogen had crossed the threshold, and the continent was now in its merciless grip. The disease, transmitted by fleas that infested rats and, more ominously, humans themselves, exhibited a relentless and inexorable pace of spread. What ensued was nothing short of catastrophic. The Black Plague, often presenting in its most common form as the bubonic plague, ushered in a reign of terror. Those afflicted would experience the sudden onset of fever, accompanied by chills, weakness, and excruciatingly swollen lymph nodes, aptly named buboes. It was a torment beyond imagination. However, the plague was not confined to the bubonic form alone. In its deadliest incarnation, the pneumonic plague, the disease targeted the respiratory system. Victims would endure agonizing bouts of coughing, characterized by the expulsion of infected respiratory droplets. Death in such cases was swift and inevitable. The Black Plague's mortality rate was nothing short of staggering. Amidst the horror and despair it wrought upon medieval Europe, the disease exacted a fearsome toll. Estimates, though imprecise, suggest that the Black Death extinguished the lives of an estimated 75 to 200 million individuals across the continent. To grasp the magnitude of this calamity, one must envision entire towns and villages being reduced to ghostly remnants of their former selves. Some communities witnessed the most harrowing devastation, with mortality rates soaring to unthinkable heights. In the darkest corners of Europe, the plague's touch was so merciless that entire populations perished, leaving behind chilling echoes of what was once vibrant civilization. In the worst-hit areas, death claimed up to 90% of the populace, transforming thriving communities into desolate landscapes of suffering and despair. The sheer scale of death was so overwhelming that it defied conventional means of burial. Mass graves, gouged hastily from the earth, became the grim repositories for the countless bodies. These trenches of sorrow bore witness to the inexorable march of death, serving as a stark reminder of the plague's remorseless brutality. In the face of such devastation, survivors grappled with the weight of grief and loss. Families were torn asunder, and the bonds of kinship strained to their limits. The wails of mourners filled the air, and the tolling of funeral bells became a haunting refrain. Europe was plunged into an abyss of anguish, its people left to contemplate the depths of suffering and the specter of death that loomed over them. The arrival of the Black Plague in Europe was nothing short of apocalyptic. Its origins in the distant steppes of Central Asia had birthed a pestilence of unprecedented ferocity. It spread with ruthless efficiency, striking terror into the hearts of all who stood in its path. As medieval Europe grappled with this implacable adversary, it would soon become evident that the Black Plague was not just a medical crisis. It was a cataclysm that would reshape the very fabric of society and history itself. The Black Plague's grim shadow eventually began to recede, but its haunting legacy endured for generations. As Europe emerged from the darkest depths of the pandemic, it became apparent that the continent had been irrevocably altered. One of the most profound changes lay in the shattering of the age-old feudal system. The depopulation wrought by the Black Plague had catastrophic consequences for the feudal structure. Entire villages had been decimated, leaving vast stretches of land untended. The scarcity of labor meant that peasants and workers, previously bound to the land and subservient to the nobility, suddenly found themselves in a dramatically altered landscape. With fewer individuals to toil on the estates of the aristocracy, those who survived held a newfound and potent bargaining power. Wages for laborers and artisans skyrocketed as they realized their irreplaceable value. The relationship between the nobility and the emerging middle class began to shift, heralding the decline of feudalism. This pivotal moment in history laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the profound societal changes that would accompany it. The Black Plague's relentless assault on Europe's population carried with it a crisis of faith and an existential reckoning for religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church. For centuries, the Church had stood as an unwavering pillar of authority and influence, but its inability to prevent or effectively respond to the plague eroded its standing. As the pandemic raged on, the faithful turned to the Church for solace and protection, only to find that prayers and rituals offered little respite from the relentless suffering. This crisis of confidence in the Church's ability to safeguard both spiritual and physical well-being led to a profound reevaluation of religious institutions. One of the enduring consequences of this reevaluation was the emergence of the Protestant Reformation. The disillusionment with the Catholic Church's response to the Black Plague set the stage for a seismic shift in the religious landscape of Europe. Visionaries like Martin Luther would go on to challenge the Church's teachings and practices, sparking a wave of religious reform that would reshape Christianity and lead to the establishment of Protestant denominations. Paradoxically, the Black Plague played an unexpected role in catalyzing certain advancements in the field of medicine and healthcare. As the disease ravaged communities, survivors who had developed some degree of immunity found themselves uniquely positioned to care for the afflicted. These individuals became the first caregivers and nurses, setting in motion a transformative trajectory for medical practices. The rudimentary understanding of contagion in the medieval era began to evolve as caregivers observed patterns of transmission and recovery. While this nascent understanding was far from comprehensive, it marked a critical departure from earlier superstitions and ineffective containment measures. In the centuries that followed, this embryonic knowledge of healthcare would evolve into the foundations of modern nursing and medical practices. The experiences of the Black Plague served as a crucible for the development of medical expertise and caregiving, ultimately benefiting generations to come. The Black Plague stands as a somber and catastrophic chapter in the annals of medieval Europe. Its arrival brought death and suffering on an unprecedented scale, leaving in its wake a continent forever transformed. Yet, even amidst the darkness and despair, glimmers of progress and resilience emerged. The collapse of feudalism and the rise of the middle class would lay the foundation for the societal and economic shifts that would characterize the Renaissance and the subsequent eras. The Protestant Reformation, born from a crisis of faith, would reshape the religious landscape of Europe and alter the course of Christianity. The emergence of caregiving and the beginnings of medical knowledge would ultimately lead to the development of modern healthcare practices. As we reflect on the Black Plague's enduring impact, we are reminded of the indomitable resilience of the human spirit and the capacity of societies to adapt and rebuild, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. In the darkness of that medieval pandemic, seeds of change were sown, ultimately shaping the Europe of the Renaissance and beyond. The aftermath of the Black Plague was nothing short of cataclysmic. Medieval Europe, once teeming with life and activity, now resembled a landscape of desolation. The pandemic's indiscriminate grasp had severed the lifeblood of communities, and the consequences rippled across all facets of society. One of the most striking transformations was the upheaval of established social structures. As the Black Plague claimed the lives of skilled laborers and artisans in staggering numbers, a profound shift occurred in the socio-economic landscape. With the scarcity of workers, those who survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. The resulting surge in wages for laborers and craftsmen marked a tectonic shift in the balance of power, challenging the dominion of the aristocracy. The once entrenched feudal system, where peasants toiled under the yoke of landowning nobles, began to erode. As workers realized their newfound value, they demanded better conditions, higher pay, and greater autonomy. The repercussions of this transformation would resonate throughout history, sowing the seeds for the emergence of the middle class and the eventual transition to more equitable systems of governance. Economic turmoil and famine. The economic fallout of the Black Plague was profound and far-reaching. The devastation wreaked havoc on trade routes, turning them into treacherous pathways plagued by fear and uncertainty. Merchants and traders, once the lifeblood of the medieval economy, found their livelihoods imperiled. The consequences of this economic disruption reverberated across the continent. As the plague's relentless grip continued, the medieval economy spiraled into turmoil. Scarce labor drove up wages, while the reduced workforce stifled production and agricultural output. The result was a sharp rise in food prices, rendering even basic necessities beyond the reach of many. Famine became an all too frequent companion to the plague, amplifying the suffering of a population already pushed to the brink. Communities struggled to secure sustenance, and hunger stalked the land with ruthless efficiency. Desperation turned people against one another, with reports of theft, banditry, and even cannibalism emerging as harrowing indicators of the depths to which society had plummeted. Religious and cultural responses. In the face of such relentless suffering, people sought solace and answers in the realm of faith. The Catholic Church, already a formidable institution, assumed even greater influence during the Black Plague. As the disease's horrors unfolded, religious fervor reached fervent heights. Individuals, their hearts heavy with dread, turned to the Church for salvation and divine protection from the relentless pandemic. One striking manifestation of this heightened religiosity was the emergence of the flagellants. These fervent religious zealots believed that self-inflicted punishment could atone for sins and halt the plague's rampage. Clad in hooded robes, they roamed the streets, their chants and self-flagellation serving as desperate pleas to the heavens. Artistic and literary expressions of despair. The profound impact of the Black Plague found poignant expression in the arts and literature of the period. Artists sought to capture the pervasive dread and morbidity that hung like a pall over Europe. Paintings of the Dance of Death depicted macabre scenes of skeletons leading individuals from all walks of life to their graves. These haunting images served as a stark reminder of the inescapable specter of death, a constant companion in those dire times. In the realm of literature, Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron offered a vivid portrayal of the chaos and despair that gripped Europe. Set against the backdrop of the Black Plague, the work chronicled the stories of 10 young people who sought refuge from the pandemic's horrors by retreating to a secluded villa. Through a collection of tales, Boccaccio painted a vivid picture of a society in turmoil, grappling with the profound uncertainty of life and death. Desperate attempts at containment in the face of the Black Plague's relentless onslaught, medieval Europe resorted to desperate measures to contain the disease. However, the understanding of contagion and disease transmission in that era was rudimentary at best. Efforts to isolate infected individuals, the use of rudimentary protective clothing, and even the quarantining of entire ships arriving from plague-stricken areas were among the measures taken. Unfortunately, these attempts proved largely ineffective in curbing the pandemic's relentless rampage. Superstitions and scapegoats. As fear and desperation escalated, medieval Europe descended into a maelstrom of superstitions and scapegoating. The pervasive paranoia found a target in the Jewish communities, which were already marginalized and vulnerable. Blame for the plague's devastation was laid at their doorstep, and a wave of persecution and violence against Jews swept across Europe. These horrific events, known as pogroms, revealed the depths of paranoia and irrationality that gripped the continent. In their desperate search for someone to hold accountable, communities turned against their own neighbors, unleashing a wave of violence and hatred that compounded the suffering already wrought by the Black Plague. The Black Plague had plunged medieval Europe into a harrowing abyss of economic upheaval, famine, religious fervor, and irrationality. As societies grappled with the relentless pandemic, they faced challenges that would test the very foundations of their civilization. Amidst the darkness, some glimmers of resilience and transformation would begin to emerge, hinting at the potential for recovery and renewal.